In the aftermath of yet another school shooting in the United States, the initial response from national leaders followed a pattern that has become tragically familiar. Statements of sympathy, expressions of shock, and calls for prayers quickly appeared across social media. But this time, one of those responses, delivered by Vice President J.D. Vance, did more than fade into the background of routine condolences. Instead, it reignited a long-simmering debate over leadership, accountability, and what survivors expect from those in power. On Saturday, following reports of a shooting at Brown University in Rhode Island that resulted in at least 2 deaths, J.D. Vance issued a public statement on social media. His message acknowledged the gravity of the situation and emphasized federal readiness. "Terrible news out of Rhode Island this evening," Vance wrote. "We're all monitoring the situation and the FBI stands ready to do anything to help." He concluded with a line that has become a standard feature of political responses to mass violence: "We're all thinking of and praying for the victims tonight." Within hours, the comment began circulating widely, not only because of the tragedy itself, but because of how it was received by those most directly affected by gun violence. Among them was Zoe Weissman, a sophomore at Brown University who survived the Parkland school shooting years earlier. Her perspective, shaped by multiple encounters with mass violence, would soon bring a sharp and deeply personal critique into the national conversation. Appearing on MS Now, Weissman was asked to respond directly to the vice president's remarks. The host posed a question that has echoed after countless tragedies: is that enough from leadership in this country? What followed was not a measured political rebuttal, but an expression of exhaustion, one rooted in lived experience rather than ideology. "It's honestly laughable," Weissman replied. Her reaction cut through the familiar script of political condolences. Rather than focusing on intent or tone, she focused on outcomes, or what she described as the lack of them. Weissman pointed out that the same administration now offering prayers had been in power during the Parkland shooting, one of the deadliest school shootings in modern U.S. history. At that time, she said, the response was nearly identical. "They sent their thoughts and prayers and told us that they were thinking of us," she said. Clearly they weren't. For Weissman, the repetition of language across different tragedies was not comforting, it was evidence of stagnation. Her comments reflected a broader frustration shared by many students and survivors who have grown up watching cycles of violence followed by cycles of statements, with little visible change in policy or prevention. The Brown University shooting, still under investigation, has become more than an isolated tragedy in public discourse. It has become another reference point in a long timeline of mass shootings that have shaped a generation's relationship with government responses. For students like Weissman, who have survived more than one such event, each new incident reopens old wounds and reintroduces unresolved questions. On MS Now, Weissman made it clear that her criticism was not limited to one individual or one statement. Instead, she framed her response as a reaction to what she described as systemic inaction. "If they actually cared about us," she said, "and they actually wanted us to do well, they would do something to end the gun violence problem in this country." Her words resonated widely online, particularly among younger audiences who have come of age during an era defined by school lockdown drills, active shooter alerts, and viral footage of violence. To many of them, phrases like thoughts and prayers have lost their meaning, not because empathy is unwelcome, but because it has not been accompanied by change. J.D. Vance's statement itself was not unusual by political standards. In fact, it closely resembled responses issued by leaders from both parties after similar events. Acknowledging the tragedy, expressing solidarity with victims, and emphasizing law enforcement readiness have become standard components of crisis communication. Yet it is precisely that predictability that has drawn criticism. Analysts note that political language after mass shootings often aims to balance compassion with caution, avoiding premature conclusions while signaling concern. But survivors and advocates increasingly argue that such balance feels hollow when repeated over decades without substantive shifts in policy. The result, they say, is a growing disconnect between leadership rhetoric and public expectation. Weissman's reference to Parkland added another layer of weight to her critique. The Parkland shooting sparked one of the largest student-led gun reform movements in U.S. history, bringing national attention to the voices of survivors. Despite that momentum, federal gun legislation has remained deeply contested, with incremental changes falling short of what many activists demand. When Weissman spoke about being fed up, she was not only addressing the current administration, but Congress as a whole. She pointed to what she described as legislative inaction, a failure to translate public mourning into concrete measures aimed at prevention. Her remarks echoed sentiments expressed by many advocacy groups, who argue that the burden of recurring violence is disproportionately borne by students. The contrast between official statements and survivor responses highlights a broader shift in public discourse. Where once expressions of sympathy were largely accepted without challenge, they are now increasingly scrutinized, particularly by those who have experienced violence firsthand. For them, leadership is measured less by words and more by outcomes. At the same time, supporters of traditional responses argue that immediate moments after tragedy are not conducive to policy debate, and that expressions of solidarity serve an important role. They contend that federal investigations and law enforcement coordination are critical first steps, and that complex legislative solutions require time and consensus. Yet for students like Weissman, time feels like a luxury that has already been exhausted. As the investigation into the Brown University shooting continues, the political fallout is only beginning to take shape. J.D. Vance's remarks, while brief, have become a focal point for renewed debate over how leaders respond to mass violence, and whether those responses meet the expectations of a generation that has grown up under its shadow. What remains unresolved is not only how this administration will respond moving forward, but how many more times survivors will be asked to accept the same words after different tragedies. And as the nation once again turns its attention from shock to debate, a deeper question lingers. Has the language of leadership itself become part of the problem? As the immediate shock of the Brown University shooting began to settle, attention shifted from the crime scene to the national conversation that followed. What initially appeared to be a standard political response quickly evolved into a flashpoint, not because of what was said, but because of how familiar it sounded. Vice President J.D. Vance's statement, centered on sympathy, prayer, and federal readiness, became emblematic of a broader pattern that many students and survivors say has repeated itself for years. Media reaction intensified as Weissman's comments circulated. Clips of her interview on MS Now spread rapidly across social platforms, accompanied by captions highlighting the generational divide between political leaders and students who have grown up amid recurring school shootings. The framing was not partisan so much as experiential, survivors speaking from lived trauma versus officials speaking from institutional protocol. Political analysts noted that Vance's language followed a well-established template. Acknowledgement of tragedy, assurance of monitoring, and invocation of prayer have become default components of crisis communication. Yet critics argued that repetition without policy follow-through has transformed that template into a symbol of stagnation. The phrase thoughts and prayers, once intended as an expression of empathy, has increasingly been interpreted by some audiences as a substitute for action. Within hours, lawmakers, advocates, and commentators weighed in. Student groups at Brown University released statements calling for a renewed focus on campus safety and national gun policy discussions. While they did not single out Vance by name, their language reflected the same frustration voiced by Weissman, a sense that leadership responses remain disconnected from the urgency felt by those directly affected. Behind the scenes, Democratic strategists viewed the exchange as politically significant. They argued that reactions like Weissman's illustrate a growing vulnerability for leaders who rely on traditional messaging after mass violence. Younger voters, in particular, have shown decreasing patience for symbolic responses, according to recent polling. For them, leadership credibility is increasingly tied to tangible outcomes rather than rhetoric. Republican allies of Vance defended his remarks, emphasizing that immediate responses to tragedies are not the appropriate venue for legislative debate. They pointed out that federal investigations and law enforcement coordination are critical in the early stages of such incidents. Some also cautioned against politicizing grief, arguing that calls for prayer reflect genuine concern rather than indifference. Still, the escalation continued. Weissman's reference to Parkland carried special weight, reminding viewers that the debate over gun violence spans administrations and parties. Parkland became a turning point in national activism, yet survivors have repeatedly expressed disappointment that momentum faded without producing sweeping reform. By invoking that history, Weissman reframed the Brown University shooting as part of an unresolved national crisis rather than an isolated event. As coverage expanded, cable news panels debated whether leadership responses should evolve. Some commentators suggested that the expectation for immediate policy proposals after tragedy is unrealistic. Others countered that repeated tragedies demand a shift in tone, if not immediate legislation, then at least acknowledgement of systemic failure. The conflict also exposed tension within media narratives themselves. Traditional reporting often emphasizes restraint and neutrality in the immediate aftermath of violence. Survivor-led critiques, however, challenge that norm by introducing moral urgency into the conversation. Weissman's comments did not accuse specific individuals of wrongdoing. Instead, they questioned the adequacy of a system that appears unchanged despite years of trauma. This clash of perspectives has become increasingly common. Students who have survived shootings now occupy a unique space in public discourse, both victims and commentators. Their voices complicate the usual top-down flow of political messaging, forcing leaders to respond not only to events but to lived testimony. As days passed, attention turned to whether the administration would adjust its messaging or approach. J.D. Vance did not publicly respond to Weissman's critique, and the White House maintained its focus on law enforcement readiness. That silence itself became a subject of discussion, with some interpreting it as strategic restraint and others as missed opportunity for engagement. The escalation revealed a deeper conflict, not between individuals, but between expectations. For political leaders, crisis responses are governed by protocol, precedent, and caution. For survivors, each repetition of the same language feels like confirmation that lessons have not been learned. By the end of the weekend, the conversation had expanded beyond Brown University. Commentators drew parallels to other campuses, other shootings, and other moments when public mourning collided with policy inertia. Weissman's words became shorthand for a broader sentiment, that empathy without change is no longer enough. And as the debate intensified, another question emerged, not just about what leaders say after tragedy, but about whether the gap between words and action has become impossible to ignore. As the immediate media cycle surrounding the Brown University shooting began to cool, the deeper implications of the exchange between Vice President J.D. Vance and survivor Zoe Weissman continued to ripple outward. What initially appeared as a brief clash of words gradually revealed itself as another data point in a much larger national reckoning, one that stretches across decades of tragedy, stalled reform, and eroding public trust. For political observers, the moment underscored a growing disconnect between institutional leadership and a generation that has grown up under the constant shadow of mass shootings. Students like Weissman are not reacting to a single event, they are responding to a pattern. Their frustration is cumulative, built from years of repeated assurances that never seemed to translate into structural change. Analysts noted that Weissman's remarks resonated precisely because they were not partisan. She did not endorse a specific policy, candidate, or party. Instead, she spoke from lived experience, first at Parkland, now at Brown. That continuity gave her words moral authority, making it difficult for critics to dismiss her reaction as political opportunism. In many ways, her response reflected a broader generational exhaustion rather than a targeted attack. Within Washington, the administration's handling of the fallout was measured and restrained. Officials emphasized law enforcement coordination and expressed sympathy for the victims, maintaining a consistent message across agencies. Yet that consistency, once seen as stability, is increasingly perceived by critics as stagnation. The absence of new language, or new commitments, became part of the story itself. Polling experts pointed out that reactions like Weissman's align with shifting voter attitudes, particularly among younger Americans. Surveys consistently show that Gen Z and younger millennials rank gun violence as one of their top political concerns. For them, leadership credibility is less about rhetorical tone and more about demonstrable urgency. Each repetition of familiar phrases risks reinforcing the belief that leaders are out of touch with the reality students face. Republican strategists, meanwhile, cautioned against overinterpreting the moment. They argued that tragedies should not be immediately leveraged into policy debates and warned that emotionally charged responses can oversimplify complex constitutional issues. From this perspective, restraint is framed as responsibility rather than avoidance. Still, the long-term political cost of restraint remains an open question. History suggests that moments like this rarely produce immediate legislative breakthroughs, but they often contribute to slow-moving shifts in public opinion. Parkland itself did not result in sweeping federal reform, yet it helped catalyze a new generation of activists who continue to shape the national conversation. Media scholars also highlighted how the role of survivors in public discourse has evolved. In previous decades, victims were often portrayed solely as subjects of sympathy. Today, they are increasingly treated as authoritative voices, participants in debate rather than passive recipients of condolences. That shift alters the power dynamic, forcing leaders to respond not just to events, but to testimony. As the news cycle moved on, universities across the country quietly revisited their own emergency protocols and safety communications. While these steps rarely make headlines, they reflect an underlying acknowledgement that institutional preparedness alone cannot resolve the broader sense of insecurity students feel. Campus safety measures may mitigate risk, but they do not address the national scale of the problem. For J.D. Vance, the episode represents another test of leadership style in an era of heightened scrutiny. His comments followed long-established norms, yet norms themselves are increasingly under examination. What once sufficed as an appropriate response may no longer meet public expectations, especially among those who have endured repeated trauma. For Weissman and others like her, the question is not whether leaders express sympathy, but whether those expressions are paired with sustained attention once cameras move on. The cycle of tragedy, condolence, and silence has become painfully familiar. Each repetition deepens skepticism that meaningful change will ever arrive. The broader implication is not confined to one administration or one party. It speaks to a systemic challenge facing American governance: how to reconcile constitutional constraints, political realities, and moral urgency in a society where mass violence has become distressingly routine. The inability, or unwillingness, to bridge that gap risks further alienating younger generations from institutions meant to represent them. As the country looks ahead, the Brown University shooting will likely join a long list of tragedies referenced in future debates. Whether it becomes another forgotten headline or a catalyst for renewed action remains uncertain. What is clear is that patience is wearing thin, and voices like Weissman's are becoming harder to ignore. The unanswered question now is not what leaders will say after the next tragedy, but whether, when that moment comes, words alone will still be enough.